Brother Blood Angels, I have more grave news. Large amounts of psychic energy are being detected near to you. I suspect we face grave evil. Evil that we will smash with the force of good. Make haste to the warp drive room and throw the Hulk back to the warp. Fight and die!
Space Hulk: Vengeance of the Blood Angels is a game that came out in 1995, as a sequel to the well-liked, if not always well-understood, 1993 game, Space Hulk. This sequel was quite well received, winning some awards and reaching a much wider audience than the first one did. It aimed to fix most of the problems of the first game, but in doing so, I personally think they lost sight of what gave the first game its unmistakable identity. The franchise was based off of the Space Hulk board game by Games Workshop, in which you play as a team of Terminator-armored Space Marines in the claustrophobic hallways of derelict Space Hulks, and try and survive the endless tide of alien monsters within. Vengeance of the Blood Angels came out originally on the 3DO, but was ported faithfully to several platforms. I chose to play the PlayStation version because I already have a PlayStation controller, and that just seemed to make the most sense to me. Both Space Hulk and its sequel were created by EA before they'd really gone on their villain arc, so you can see that there was a lot of care put into both of these titles. The decision to switch the series from the Amiga and PC to consoles went hand in hand with an effort to make these games more approachable. And it absolutely succeeded. While the console controls were a bit janky, the overall effect of these changes makes Vengeance of the Blood Angels an objectively more fun and more playable game than the first Space Hulk. But also, probably worse. A popular topic for game writers is to weigh in on whether or not video games need to be fun. Usually this is centered around games like Pathologic. The argument is typically that, as an artistic medium, video games don't actually have to be pleasant or fun to be good, because there's other things that games can be. They don't all just have to be fun little toys that make happy brain chemicals. Space Hulk in its board game form isn't fun, per se. It's designed to put one person in the hot seat as the Space Marine commander and try and stay calm and collected while the Genestealer player does their best to give them a goddamned anxiety attack. In fact, in an effort to streamline the second edition of the board game, they actually removed the turn timer from the Space Marine side, which was actually like the most stressful mechanic in the entire board game. And yet this removal didn't seem to be something that the community liked very much. And in the end, they ended up pretty much forced to bring the timer back for the third edition of the board game. I've played quite a few rounds of it now with my friends, and despite being a claustrophobia simulator, we keep going back to it. The tension and release cycle of horror and strategy are completely addictive. It's a great game, and I'm happy to play it over and over, even if it doesn't provide the traditional emotion you would expect from a board game. The first Space Hulk video game is single-handedly the most unique board game adaptation I have ever seen. No other video game that I've played has managed to retain the soul of its source material quite so accurately. It was a game that didn't just put the board game into a computer as a replication, nor was it a game that departed heavily from the tabletop. It was a game that managed to understand the intent of all the board game mechanics and translate those into video game mechanics that would accomplish the same intent. It was magnificent. It was breathtaking. It was a fucking nightmare, and it was so difficult and claustrophobic that if you watched my video on the subject, you'll remember that it's basically the only video game that has ever managed to legit make me feel despair. And it's also the first to require a real personal journey on my part to try and beat it. It is a challenging and deeply unpleasant game, but it is nonetheless one of the greatest tabletop video games ever made. So, to circle back, with horror, stress, and pride in your own gritty determination as the point of this franchise, you might begin to understand why having the sequel be more fun might actually compromise the integrity of the work. But we have put the cart miles in front of the horse. This, after all, is a game review, not a video essay. So we should talk about the game before I can properly show you what I mean. If you found my channel through my last Space Hulk video, then I'd like to say, Christ, that could go through Terminator armor. But if you're new here, then I'd like to introduce myself. I'm William SRD, and I make videos reviewing all manner of video games related to tabletop franchises. Usually this takes the form of Warhammer or Dungeons & Dragons games. Often retro games from the 90s that most people have not heard of. So if that sounds good to you, then consider subscribing and possibly liking this video to enable me to create more Space Hulk videos. Now, in case you didn't watch the first video, let me give you a lightning round version of the Space Hulk lore, then we can expand on some of the lore stuff that I touched on last time but didn't really expand on. Space Hulk is part of the Warhammer 40k franchise by Games Workshop. It was created in 1989 as a very explicit ripoff of the Alien movies. And this is all very early on into the history of 40k, since 40k in its first edition only came out in 1986. As such, you're going to notice some subtle lore and tone differences compared to 40k as we know it today. The main trio of stars in Space Hulk are the Space Marines, the Space Hulks, and the Genestealers. The protagonists are pretty much always either the Space Marines of the Blood Angel chapter or the Deathwing Company of the Dark Angels. The first game was all about the Dark Angels, so naturally the sequel is going to be about the Blood Angels. But what exactly are they getting vengeance upon? In one of their earliest encounters with the Space Hulk and the Genestealers within, the Blood Angels sent their entire chapter into a Hulk called the Sin of Damnation. It was a slaughter, and only 50 of the 1,000-man chapter was left alive and in disgrace. Losing that many Space Marines is actually incredibly shocking in Warhammer 40k lore, so this was a huge event, and it went on to shape how the Imperium approached Space Hulks forever after. Rather than just allow chapters to be butchered in their entirety, from now on only the 100 best Marines, equipped with colossal and ancient Terminator armor, would be permitted into the ships. These veterans would work in fire teams to achieve key objectives, rather than trying to invade the ship outright, as I suspect they did during their first attempt. The Blood Angels, naturally, have a bit of a sore spot in their memory from the time they were defeated by the Sin of Damnation. Being how prominent they are in Space Hulk stories, it's likely that they now go out of their way to assault them. It's become personal. Every last Hulk cleared or redirected back into the warp is another bit of vengeance for the Blood Angels. Space Hulks themselves are, in modern lore, when numerous derelict ships get all smashed up together. All manners of nasty creatures like orcs, demons, and Genestealers end up infesting these Hulks, and need to be wiped out, lest they make their way onto human planets as the Hulks pass them by. Now in old lore, which is the lore this game is set in, Space Hulks didn't necessarily need to be big conglomerations of ships. They could be single vessels, as long as they were large enough. Space Hulk back then kinda just meant a derelict ship. The one we're clearing out in this game is considered to be an especially bad Space Hulk, because it's made of multiple ships. Nowadays, we would just call that a Space Hulk. But 90s lore was a bit different. Now, on to the Genestealers, because this is where I got a lot of people mad at me in my last video. Genestealers are a species of alien that infects human hosts, and interbreeds with humans through the resulting hybrids, to eventually produce pure strain Genestealers. The reason Hulks are usually full of Genestealers is because they like to stow away on ships as they pass between worlds. But if a ship containing one of these stowaways gets destroyed and becomes part of a Space Hulk, then the survivors are naturally going to eventually get overrun by the growing Genestealer infestation. Now, here's the controversial thing I said about Genestealers. Genestealers are a type of alien that kind of has a shaky relationship with the Warhammer canon. Sometimes they're a type of Tyranid, sometimes they're not, and sometimes it seemed like they've been soft retconned. It can be kinda hard to keep track of where they are in the lore. Tyranids, by the way, are an intergalactic hive mind moving in from a neighboring galaxy to consume the Milky Way. And Genestealers are a species of Tyranid. I think people thought I was making a lore statement there. I was not. I was making a statement about canon. When Genestealers were created, they were created as a standalone alien with no connection to the Tyranids. Over the course of the 90s, some pieces of 40k media slowly started saying that they were Tyranids, or implying that they might be, starting with Advanced Space Crusade in 1990. There isn't an exact date when they officially became Tyranids in all media, but the process was more or less complete by the year 2000. There were no mentions of Tyranids in the Space Hulk board game or either of the two video games from the 90s, which is why I said they weren't really important to the lore in my last video. There are, of course, arguments about whether or not they always were, and whether it was just kind of a storytelling technique, rather than being like, retcons and messy canon and stuff. This is a debate that once in a while rages across forums. The reason I skimmed over all of this last time was because I didn't want to trigger an angry forum debate. And in doing so, I triggered a lore debate. Oops. Listen, okay, YouTube is a field full of rakes, and you can't go 3 feet without stepping on at least one. Now, on to the simpler lore as we get in-game. Oh no, it a Space Hulk, someone called the Space Marines. I have quite a lot to say about the first steps into the Hulk. I was impressed immediately about how fluid the first-person controls and movement was. While I maintained that the rigidity of the Terminators in an enclosed space was probably lost here, the controls really did have that lovely sensation of being just right. The tutorial was a nice quick 4 missions affair, instead of the dozen or so tutorials from the first game. However, there is the assumption that before you start the campaign, you're going to take some time to practice the controls you just learned using the famous missions from ages past, starring specific Terminators in your squad. I only tried a handful of them, but they largely take the form of missions where you control a single Terminator and fulfill objectives. Noticeably, these missions are the only place in the game where I found non-standard gear items like chain fists. They never appeared in any campaign maps at all. Regardless, the tutorials plus the famous missions were a great way to learn the controls, but a terrible way to learn the game. I'll explain why in a second. Regardless of if you took the time to try the famous missions, your first steps into the Hulk are just as a standard Terminator, not as a squad leader. It's complete chaos, really, as you attempt to go where the AI commander tells you to go. It's not that difficult, but it was kind of a nice change of pace, actually, to not be responsible for how the mission goes for once. But here's the thing. Although the basic tutorial teaches you the squad controls, both the famous missions and the first few campaign missions have you playing this game like it's a first-person shooter. Now, this game has a reputation for having a savage difficulty curve, but I don't think that's really warranted. I think this game caused so many people to have a hard time because it just had a really hard time explaining to people what it was. This is a game where you will live and die based off of how well you can control your squad. But you could easily sink 4 to 5 hours into Vengeance before you ever have to play it in any other way than just acting like it's a shooter. I can imagine a lot of teenagers in the 90s who played the first few missions, had a great time, and were suddenly then told to command a squad and hit a brick wall of difficulty they were not prepared for, because the game had already trained them to play this game like an FPS. And this confusion was widespread. Virtually every contemporary review I read bothered to explain about whether or not the game should be compared to Doom. Do not be fooled. The FPS elements may be a lot meatier than the first Space Hulk game, but Vengeance of the Blood Angels is still a squad combat board game at heart. So let me say it clearly. Space Hulk, Vengeance of the Blood Angels, is not a Doom clone, no matter how much it tricks you into thinking it is one in the early missions. Beyond this, the other big thing that's immediately noticeable is just how much the graphics have improved since the first game. This is honestly my favorite part of 90s gaming, because the graphics just moved at light speed, and a 2-year gap in time is the difference between these two products. That said, both games share the fact that they looked stunning in their release era, and they still, in my opinion, both hold up to this day. The art direction is really there to elevate the experience, and everything looks better than ever. The Terminators look like your eyes can actually read what they are this time, and the Genestealers are also impressively drawn, and occasionally even 3D rendered in a way that's really quite seamless. But as big of an upgrade as the unit models got, the improvements to the Space Hulk graphics are really the star of the show here. These things look so much better, and way more varied than the first game. I love how dark and brooding these environments are, as well as how there are now all these fine details and clutter that weren't there in the first game. Specifically, the level of gore and viscera that gets splashed all over the walls is awesome. I mean, it looks pretty good when you do it, but the effect is so much better when you factor in squad combat. I'd often be holding down some hallway with my squad leader, and then when the time came to catch up with the rest of the gang, I'd walk into these unfamiliar rooms that were fucking bathed in blood. And you'd be like, damn, I only saw this place on the radar before, but God, a real massacre went on here while I wasn't looking. These spaces all feel real in ways that they didn't in the first game, and Vengeance of the Blood Angels really is a landmark in the evolution of the 40k aesthetic in gaming. Amusingly, there are a few details that look surprisingly mundane though. Look at these shelves in the storage levels. These are normal looking industrial shelves full of binders and stuff. You would see this in real life. Might seem weird that I'm bringing that up, but after 40 years of world building and tripling down on a commitment to high gothic techno babble, you pretty much never see normal stuff in 40k anymore. I've been reading through the PDF of Imperium Maledictum, the spiritual successor to Dark Heresy that just came out, and you see administratum levels that look like this. There are no longer metal industrial shelves with binders and folders in 40k.
There are only Adeptus Administratum curation crypts.
There are no longer secretaries.
There are now chapter serfs, the sworn bondsmen of the Adeptus Astartes.
There are no longer cats named Daisy.
There is only the Primarch of the Dark Angels chapter, Lion L.
The other explanation, if you choose to interpret it this way, is that perhaps these mundane areas date back to the dark age of technology. Before the ecclesiarchy mandated that every square inch of the Imperium must be gone over with a skull bedazzler. Regardless of the reasoning, I quite like the design of the ships, both the mundane stuff and the high gothic stuff alike. There's actually very little to no music in this game, so I'm going to opt to skip that entirely, other than to say that the soundscape was so full that you don't really miss the music very much. Though the intro does contain 2 original tracks, and honestly, they fucking slap. You're listening to one of them in the background right now. The sound effects are a natural step up from the first game, with guns especially sounding significantly better. I mean, they sound more like machine guns rather than the enormous stormbolters they are in actuality, but nevertheless, it sounds incredibly immersive to walk through the hallways and hear your troops laying down fire across the Hulk. There's very little ambiance in this game though, but you won't notice. Your ears will constantly be filled with gunfire, comms chatter, and the roar and screams of Genestealers being blasted to pieces. It's a crescendo of individual elements that come together very competently. The voiceovers are the biggest subject to talk about here, because they did some experiments in an attempt to push the envelope. The first game's use of voice acting was a big step forwards for video games, with Marines over the comm serving as an extension of the user interface, calling out targets, confirming kills, or even making it known that they'd been overrun. All of that is back in Vengeance of the Blood Angels, but they've chosen to take it even a few steps farther. The voice work is entirely modular, meaning that every single Marine and object that can be interacted with has been spoken aloud, and can then be formatted into sentences. Unfortunately, the delivery mostly doesn't work very well, due to there being these strangely long pauses between the subject and the rest of the sentence.
Incoming on Viconius. Viconius, search this area for an archived record. I can't see an archived record. I haven't found an archived record.
Still, it does help to make the audio a good supplement to the user interface, just like the first game did. And this time you usually know exactly which Marine is talking. Because in addition to the name shoutouts, a lot of these Marines have been given like extra personality.
Every Terminator friend group has the murderer, The live streamer.
There is a lot of movement out there.
The cowboy.
That's right. If you needed a reminder that 90s 40k is a bit of a different beast, you just heard a Space Marine shout yeehaw. By the way, leave a comment down below. Which chapter of Space Marines is the most yeehaw out of all of them? Inquiring minds need to know. Anyway, the modular dialogue succeeded in some ways, but failed in others. It wasn't a great effect, but I really don't want to fault the game for trying something new, just because it didn't work. I will say, with all the dialogue going through the comms, I swear, our sergeant needs to be able to yell at these idiots to keep the channel clear though. They cut each other off constantly, so you'll really frequently miss those important shoutouts that you need to be listening for. Because your Marines are off delivering one-liners or exclaiming that, hey, golly gee, there sure are a lot of these Genestealers. That about sums up all my thoughts on the presentation, so let's get to the gameplay. Right away, it's immediately obvious that this is a strategy title that was primarily for consoles. So there's a bit too much rotating between characters and actions for my taste, when I'd much rather just click on the thing I want to do like I did in the first game. It's actually not so bad though, and despite the change to the console, the controls have actually been greatly improved. You have more control than ever over the movements of your Terminators. So what exactly do we do with these Terminators in a Space Hulk game? Well, just like the first one, Vengeance has us attempting to travel around the Hulk and complete various objectives while ensuring that you have Marines stationed in key locations to intercept Genestealers before they can overrun your team. It's fairly tactical, and it requires you to have to consider when is the correct time to move a piece, because moving around corners is when you're at your most vulnerable to the attacking Genestealers. But while the basic core is the same, everything surrounding that has changed a lot compared to the first game. For starters, you didn't have a main character in the original. You could flip between the screens of your Space Marines and take manual control of any unit you needed in order to give them some extra oomph. This was sort of a translation of the command point mechanic in the board game, where you could give extra actions to your pieces when needed. This is absent in Vengeance. You take first-person control of the squad leader and can only move your other pieces through the radar screen. You will find that the timer is back though, and I hope we see it return in future games as well. The mechanics of this timer work a little bit differently this time around though. The tabletop timer gives the Space Marine players 3 minutes to play their turn in order to simulate the pressure of the situation. This was adapted into the original computer game with a fairly generous freeze time allowance that could be used for planning your moves. Vengeance, on the other hand, puts the pressure on you like the first game never did. Your freeze timer is short, and although it regenerates quite quickly, you'll either need to be moving your pieces in real time a lot more, or you have to be very strategic about when and where you're moving. The flip side of it is that this isn't done in isolation. A timer this short would have been a death sentence in the first game, which was so RNG focused that you couldn't really hold a position for very long before you'd get overrun. Marines in Vengeance of the Blood Angels, however, are much more capable. They pretty much always kill Stealers, no muss, no fuss, provided they aren't positioned in extremely short hallways or run into Genestealers while rounding corners. This means that unlike the first game, you're actually going to be able to hold a perimeter for a reasonable amount of time while your timer regenerates. So while you have less time to act, you're actually in less of a rush. Unfortunately, I think this added power about what the Marines can accomplish does come with a cost. It breaks a rule that I deem to be pretty non-negotiable in Space Hulk. These suits are cumbersome and difficult and unwieldy, and you'll need to position your Marines so carefully to hold down very specific firing lines, usually down long, straight hallways. Because when a Genestealer's coming at you, there is no time to turn around. Not so in Vengeance of the Blood Angels. You can plop a Marine down in the center of a giant room with 8 entrances, and he'll spin around like a turret, keeping the entire place clear. The Marines completely evaporate Genestealers, easily killing 3 to 4 times what you could manage in the first game. The maps are designed very differently too, with wider rooms being a near constant to accommodate the larger range of motion. All in all, your Marines are stronger, less restricted, and more agile. I get why they did it this way. It's easier, and frankly, it's more fun. But again, that fun comes at the cost of the core stuff that makes Space Hulk the claustrophobia simulator that it is. The game is more appealing, and it's actually easier for me to recommend to you, but it lost something along the way. And I think that something was unique in ways that so few games are. One cool new thing that I am very happy we got, though, is that there are now 2 styles of play you can choose from, and both appear to be equally valid ways to beat the game. I myself found that trying to control up to 10 Terminators, often in real time, left me as a bit of a distracted Terminator sergeant. I was constantly in the radar, so I sucked at holding down hallways, cause, I was in the map too much. And being that you actually only lose the game when the main character dies, I chose to just treat my main guy kind of like the king's piece in chess, just well behind my lines and focus on beating the map by controlling all my pieces. That meant that I could focus on playing Space Hulk like Space Hulk, utilizing all of my pieces to the best of their abilities. The second method is the one that I watched other people do after my own playthrough. You could instead do as they do, and use your leader as an unkillable point man, and just use the other Marines to essentially just kind of cover your ass. This looks very difficult and like it's a lot to manage, but that's probably why this game has such a reputation for difficulty, because this is kind of the instinctual way that most people think you're supposed to play it. It's valid, it works, and it's really impressive that these guys were able to do it. But this is still Space Hulk, so by playing it like Space Hulk, I found that I actually only came across one mission that gave me any real difficulty. It's called Baron, a colossal level where you have to guide 10 Marines across a twisting maze of routes, each more dangerous than the last. In the end, I had to resort to save scumming a little with my emulator so that I wasn't forced to restart the entire mission just to experiment with each of the several hundred combinations of routes. Still though, even with that as a time-saving trick, this map took me 8 hours of solid trial and error to figure out how to get the team safely through. So with all of that out of the way, I suppose you want to know what the story of this campaign is, huh? It's very bare bones, but the Chapter Master keeps us up to speed with what's going on between missions. Without any ability to destroy the Hulk itself, the best answer is to locate a working warp drive and force the Hulk back into the warp. The first few missions are all about that, but the warp drive we find ends up being broken. From then on, there's 10 missions where the Chapter Master is like, we must go deeper. Eventually, in the depths of this Hulk, we find another warp drive. And once we've restored a few core systems, it's ready to use. All along this journey, we've been stumbling across new enemies. Chaos Marines prowling through the dark hallways, hybrid Genestealers that attack with ranged weapons, and a powerful psychic Magus that requires numerous guns shooting in tandem to take it down. But guarding the warp drive is one final enemy, the patriarch of the entire brood, so old and swollen with psychic might that he couldn't even leave his dark throne. But when bolters could barely pierce his psychic shield, I knew it was time to purify him with holy promethium.
This area.
And then, with the final boss dead and the warp drive activated, the game ended. Except no, it actually didn't, because the warp drive didn't work. Thus, we must play this mission again, but this time backwards, so we go back to the teleporter to get a part to fix it. But now the game's done. Except, no, it's not, because now we have to play this map a third time to bring the part back to the warp drive. And, at least it's done now. They're definitely not going to make us play the map a fourth time, but of course they make us play it a fourth time. Because now we have to flee and extract ourselves back to the teleporter before the Space Hulk disappears into the warp. However, after playing this map a fourth time, it's finally done. What the fuck? Why did they make me play this map 4 times? Regardless, the last time when we are extracting is actually the best rendition of this level. It's tense, they only give you 7 minutes to do it, which is really not enough. Like any good action movie, the only two survivors I had were my main character and the rookie, with each of my veterans dying to buy time. I liked this as an ending, and I would have liked it a lot more if we didn't have those 2 repeat missions in the middle where we just do chores. Why did we have to repeat the map 4 times? Why couldn't it have just worked after we killed the boss and then we extract? Why'd we have to do chores in the middle? I am re-recording my conclusions, because listening back, I honestly think I may have come off a bit overly critical about Vengeance of the Blood Angels. To be clear, I really like this game, and really my only problem with it is how consciously it distanced itself from all the things that made the first game special. Vengeance of the Blood Angels is a very above-average board game adaptation that serves as a decent squad-based strategy game with recognizable mechanics from the board game. And in fact, I might even take back one of the claims I made at the start of the video. I might go ahead and say that it may be a better game than the first one. This is arguable, I feel a little skeeved out by saying it, but honestly, it might just be true. I mean, it's certainly more pleasant. Now, I already made my arguments earlier at the start of the video over how Space Hulk doesn't necessarily need to be fun because it's more of like a claustrophobia simulator. So I'll just let my points there stand, especially because I know that a claustrophobia simulator is certainly not for everyone, even if it's a really satisfying delivery of that concept. But what really made the first game special wasn't the claustrophobia, or even the way that it was able to deliver horror without having too many traditional horror elements. No, what made it so special was that it was a radical new way of adapting board games. Not a replication like the later Space Hulk games, nor a game simply based on the lore and ideas of the tabletop, like the Warhammer Total War games. But rather, it was a board game perfectly rebuilt for the medium of computer gaming, with the spirit of the board game and the intent of the mechanics intact, despite being radically altered to better serve the medium. It was a wild new idea, and it has rarely been attempted since. And I say rarely, mainly just to cover my ass, because I don't know that this has been attempted since. I actually noticed that shortly before my first Space Hulk video came out, Mr. Edders dropped a video about the second Hero Quest game. And you should watch it. And he mentioned how many reviewers at the time were disappointed in Hero Quest for not using the Space Hulk model of adaptation. So you can take that as evidence. I'm not the only one who could see what was going on here. So when I say that I found Vengeance of the Blood Angels disappointing, I want to be very clear about what I mean. I wasn't disappointed by the game, because the game actually kicked ass. I wasn't disappointed that we lost the claustrophobia and the intrinsic horror, because that stuff, while significantly reduced, it is still there, and we got a lot of playability in exchange for what we lost. No, what disappointed me about this game is that they solidly stepped away from the brilliant style of adaptation that they had just invented. And it's been a relatively dead technique ever since. Space Hulk dug up a gold mine. Vengeance of the Blood Angels reburied it. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. If you liked it, I would really appreciate it if you left a like and considered subscribing. But really, the best way to support the channel is to consider joining these lovely people on the credit roll and supporting me on Patreon. Anyway, I'll see you soon, everybody.